Hey y'all, it's me, Cindy Fessler, your fellow Christian warrior, here to help you know more so you can share more and grow more of God's kingdom. So, if y'all haven't already done this, you know what to do. Please make sure to smack that bell and subscribe button so that more people can see this video. More Christians can know how to share their faith with others. Thanks so much. So let's talk about who wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. And the reason these are important is, Genesis, the flood story, creation is all part of the first 5 books, also called the Talmud. You hear it talked about as the Pentateuch, Penta meaning 5, right? So this is from an article by Bodie Hodge in Answers in Genesis. And let's see what he has to say. So one of the major attacks on the Bible in the past 300 years has been directed against Moses and his authorship of the Pentateuch, or the first 5 books of the Old Testament. In the past few hundred years, the Bible has been under severe attack by scientific and philosophical skeptics of all sorts. In this scientific age, the most attacked book of the Bible has arguably been Genesis, particularly the first 11 chapters. Long age geology, Big Bang cosmology, secular archaeology, liberal theology, and philosophical attacks on miracles in the Bible have deceived many people to believe that the Bible is not true and therefore cannot be trusted. So one of the major attacks on the Bible in the past 300 years has been directed against Moses. Genesis to Deuteronomy, of course, are the books we're talking about. And such attacks on these foundational books of the rest of the Bible come both from non-Christians as well as professing Christians. So seminary courses, theology books, introductions to the Pentateuch and Bibles, and the secular media have promoted the man-made idea that Moses did not write the Pentateuch, also known as the Law or the Torah. I think I may have said Talmud earlier. It's the Torah. Instead, it is claimed that at least 4 different authors or groups of authors wrote various portions of these books over many centuries. And then one or more editors came along over many years, combined and interwove everything together into its present form. For example, one translation of the Bible we surveyed said this is its introduction to the Pentateuch. So let's see what they said about the Pentateuch. Despite its unity of plan and purpose, the book is a complex work not to be attributed to a single original author. Several sources or literary traditions that the final redactor used in its composition are discernible. These are the Yahwist, known as J, Elohist, E, and Priestly, P, sources, which in turn reflect older oral traditions. The introduction to the Old Testament and other Bible translations says that the J document, written by someone much later than Moses in the southern kingdom of Judah, and the E document was written by someone in the northern kingdom of Israel. Let's evaluate these arguments that they put forth, okay, in a defense of this hypothesis. So let's talk about the documentary hypothesis, also known as the JEDP hypothesis. Various sections of the Pentateuch are assigned to various authors who are identified by the letters J, E, D, and P. Now we know that Moses wrote these books, but scholars are trying to say it's this other group of people. So let's talk about who they are. Hence, it is called the documentary hypothesis, or JEDP model, as this hypothesis was developed by a number of Jewish and theological liberal Christian scholars in the late 17th and late 19th centuries. There were a number of different proposals of who wrote what and when. But by the end of the 19th century, liberal scholars had reached general agreement that the letters stand for J, documents and the sections, verses, or in some cases of verses that were written by one or more authors who preferred to use the Hebrew name Yahweh, Jehovah, to refer to God. It is proposed that this author wrote about 900 to 850 years before Christ. So that's the J, people that use the name Yahweh or Jehovah. Okay, so E documents are texts that use the name Elohim, it's spelled on the screen there, for God, and were supposedly written around 750 to 700 years before Christ. The D stands for Deuteronomy, most of which was written by a different author or group of authors, perhaps around the time of King Josiah's reform in 621 years before Christ. The P stands for priests and identify the texts in Leviticus and elsewhere in the Pentateuch that were written by a priest or priests during the exile in Babylon after 586 years before Christ. Then around 400 BC, some editors came along, supposedly combined all 4 of these independently written texts to form the Pentateuch, as it was known in the time of Jesus and modern times. So development of the documentary hypothesis. Where did these scholars, get the idea that these four groups of people wrote the Pentateuch? So Ezra was a very influential Jewish rabbi in the 12th century AD. While he believed in the Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch, he noticed that a few verses, for example, Genesis 12:6 and Genesis 22:14, had some phrases that seemed mysteriously out of place, but he never pursued these mysteries to resolve them. About 500 years later, the famous Jewish philosopher Baruch Spinoza, he lived between 1632 and 1677, picked up on what Ezra had stated and asserted that Ezra did not believe Moses wrote the Pentateuch. No, he's saying there was a couple lines he didn't agree with. So this Baruch Spinoza just took it and ran with it and say, oh no, Ezra doesn't believe Moses wrote the book at all. Others disagreed, pointing to other statements by Ezra that contradicted Spinoza's conclusion. In his book Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, written in 1670, Spinoza, who was a pantheist, so this guy believes in many gods, or everybody is God anyway, was subsequently excommunicated from the Jewish community and denounced by Christians, argued that Moses did not write the Pentateuch. Besides using the verses noted by Ezra, Spinoza offered a few other brief arguments against Mosaic authorship, which were easily answered by Christian writers in the following decades. But these Mosaic authorship attacks began to take hold. So nevertheless, further attacks on Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch began taking hold in France through Jean Astruc, whose book Conjectures about the original memoirs, which it appeared that Moses used in composing the book of Genesis with certain remarks which helped clarify these conjectures, was published in 1753. He believed Moses was the author of the Pentateuch, but he unlocked the door for the skepticism of later scholars. Astruc was basically questioned, as others had before him, how Moses knew what had happened prior to his own life. Right? He's writing this book long after creation and long after Noah and a lot of the things that he describes, right? So, i.e. the history recorded in Genesis. So in other words, where did Moses get the information on the patriarchs? Of course, there are several ways Moses could have obtained this information: divine revelation from God, previously written text passed down through the generations, and oral tradition from his ancestors. We'll have a whole book or a whole video on oral tradition and how that works and what that actually is. And it's going to dispel a lot of the myths on what people think it is. Regardless, under the guidance of the Holy Spirit, see 2 Peter 1:20-21, the books of Moses could be completely true and without error. Would be completely true and without error. So this French guy, Astruc, also noticed that Elohim, the Hebrew name for God, in Genesis 1:1 through 2:3 was used in Genesis 1, but then the text switches to Yahweh or Jehovah in chapter 2. Astruc claimed that these name changes indicated different sources that Moses used. Specifically, he thought that Genesis 1:1 through 2:3 was one creation account, and Genesis 2:4-24 was a different creation account. Hence, we have Elohim in one portion and Jehovah sections, or E and J documents. Thus, the first assumption of the documentary hypothesis became established. The use of different divine names means different authors of the text. So this is where they start to get off track. The German scholar Johann Eichhorn took the next step by applying Astruc's idea to the whole of Genesis. Initially, in his 1780 introduction to the Old Testament, Eichhorn said that Moses copied previous texts, but in later editions he apparently conceded the view of others that the J through E division could be applied to the whole of the Pentateuch, which was written after Moses, supposedly. Following Eichhorn, other ideas were advanced in the denial of the Mosaic authorship of the first 5 books of the Old Testament. In 1802, Johann Wachter insisted that Genesis was made from at least 39 fragments. In 1805, Wilhelm de Witt contended that none of the Pentateuch was written before King David, and that Deuteronomy was written at the time of King Josiah. From here, the door flew open to profess what other portions of the law were not written by Moses. Not only was there a J document, an E document, and a D document, but then there was argued that Leviticus and some other portions of the Pentateuch were the work of Jewish priests, hence the P documents. And today, several variant views of the documentary hypothesis exist, but perhaps the most popular is that of Julius Wellhausen, proposed in 1895. Wellhausen put dates to the alleged 4 sources, and none were earlier than around 900 BC. As noted, Old Testament scholar Gleason Archer remarks, although Wellhausen contributed no innovations to speak of, he restated the documentary theory with great skill and persuasiveness, supporting the JEDP sequence upon an evolutionary basis. So even though a great many scholars and much of the public have accepted this view, is it really true? Did Moses have little or nothing to do with writing the book of Genesis or the rest of the Pentateuch? Several lines of evidence should lead us to reject the documentary hypothesis as a fabrication of unbelievers. Here are some reasons to reject the documentary hypothesis. So there are many reasons to reject this skeptical attack on the Bible. First, consider what the Bible itself says about the authorship of the Pentateuch. So let's talk about the biblical witness to Mosaic authorship. We've got a really cool chart. Check it out. The chart here shows that the Pentateuch states that Moses wrote these books: Exodus 17:14, 24:4, 34:27, Numbers 33, 1-2, and Deuteronomy 31, 9-11. In his rejection of Mosaic authorship, Wellhausen nowhere discussed this biblical evidence. It is easy to deny Mosaic authorship if one ignores the evidence for it, but that's not honest scholarship, right? So we also have the witness of the rest of the Old Testament, Joshua 1:8, 8:31, and you can see in the chart here. The New Testament is also clear on its testimony that Moses wrote these books. The division of the Old Testament were clearly in place in the Jewish mind long before the time of Christ, namely the law of Moses, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the prophets, the historical and prophetic books, and the writings of the poetic books of Job, Psalms, Proverbs, etc. So when Jesus referred to the law of Moses, his Jewish listeners knew exactly what he was referring to. Take note of some of the references back to Moses' work. For example, John 7:22 and Acts 15:1 refer to Moses giving the doctrine of circumcision, yet John also reveals that this came earlier in Genesis with Abraham. Nevertheless, it is credited to Moses because it was recorded in his writings. The New Testament attributes all the books from Genesis through Deuteronomy as being the writings of Moses. So to attack the Mosaic authorship of the first 5 books of the Old Testament, then, is to attack the truthfulness of the rest of the biblical writers and Jesus himself. Let's talk about Moses' qualifications to write. Not only is there abundant biblical witness that Moses wrote the Pentateuch, Moses was fully qualified to write the Pentateuch. He received an Egyptian royal education. We see this in Acts 7:22, and was an eyewitness to the events recorded in Exodus to Deuteronomy, which contain many references to allusions to Egyptian names, places, people, and little g gods, as well as Egyptian words, idioms, and cultural factors. He also consistently demonstrated an outsider's view of Canaan from the perspective of Egypt or Sinai. And as a prophet of God, he was the appropriate recipient of the written words or oral traditions of the patriarchs from Adam to his own day, which the Holy Spirit could use to guide Moses to write the inherent text of the Genesis. There's no other ancient Hebrew who was more qualified than Moses to write the Pentateuch. The fallacious reasoning of the skeptics. So let's look at that. A final reason for rejecting the documentary hypothesis and accepting the biblical testimony to the Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch is the erroneous assumptions and reasoning of the liberal scholars and other skeptics. So let's look at the list. Number 1, they assumed their conclusion. Right? So they assume that the Bible is not a supernatural revelation from God, and then manipulated the biblical text to arrive at that conclusion. They were implicitly deistic or atheistic in their thinking. Number 2, they assumed that Israel's religion was simply the invention of man, a product of evolution, as all other religions are. Number 3, based on evolutionary ideas, they assumed that the art of writing was virtually unknown in Israel prior to the establishment of the Davidic monarchy. Therefore, there could have been no written records going back to the time of Moses. This claim not only attacks the intelligence of the ancient Israelites, but also the Egyptians who trained Moses. These were the Egyptians incapable of teaching Moses how to read and write? Since the time the documentary hypothesis was first proposed, guess what? Archaeologists have discovered scores of written records predating the time of Moses. It is hard to believe that Israel's ancient neighbors knew how to write, but the Jews could not. Number 4, liberal Bible scholars allegedly based their theories on evidence from the biblical text, and yet they invaded the biblical evidence that refutes their theories. So they pick and choose, right? Theirs was a pick and choose approach to studying the Bible, which is hardly an honest scholarship in pursuit of truth. Number 5, they arbitrarily assumed that the Hebrew authors were different from all other writers in history, that the Hebrews were incapable of using more than one name for God. or more than one writing style, regardless of the subject matter, or more than one of several possible synonyms for a single idea. 6. Their subjective bias led them to illegitimately assume that any biblical statement was unreliable until proven reliable, though they would not do this with any other ancient modern text. And when they found any disagreement between the Bible and ancient pagan literature, the latter was automatically given preference and trusted as a historical witness. The former violates the well-accepted concept known as Aristotle's dictum, which advises that the benefit of the doubt should be given to the document itself rather than the critic. Think about that. In other words, the Bible or any other book should be considered innocent until proven guilty, or reliable until its unreliability is compellingly demonstrated. 7. Although many examples have been found of an ancient Semitic author using repetition and duplication in his narrative technique, skeptical scholars assume that when Hebrew authors did this, it is compelling evidence of multiple authorship of the biblical text. Number 8, the skeptics erroneously assumed, without any other ancient Hebrew literature to compare with the biblical text, that they could, with scientific reliability, establish the date of the composition of each book of the Bible. Number 9, to date, no manuscript evidence of the J document, the E document, the P document, or the D document, or any other supposed fragments have ever been discovered, and there are no ancient Jewish commentaries that mention any of these imaginary documents or their alleged unnamed authors. All the manuscript evidence we have is for the first 5 books of the Bible, just as we have them today. This is confirmed by the singular Jewish testimony until the last few centuries that these books are the writings of Moses. So until it started to be questioned, this was the truth until now, when all this other crazy stuff starts to come out. Well, hey guys, thanks so much for watching this video. I am so excited that you stuck to it to the end, and I appreciate that. And please do smack that subscribe button. Check out the next video.